Hi, welcome back to the new Thinkery. I'm David Barr. As always, with me is Alex Priu.
Hey, David.
Hey, and Greg McBrayer.
Alex, David.
And our
Greg.
silent participant, who we like to thank at the outset, our producer, Jake Gannon. Thanks, Jake. As always, if you like what you hear, please follow us on Twitter at The New Thinkery or email us, thenewthinkery@gmail.com. And do visit our website where in the coming weeks, we will have show notes, especially with versions and editions of texts that we use in the show so you can follow along. The website is thenewthinkery.com. Don't forget to review us and subscribe. Pass along word to your friends and family. Today is a very interesting episode, one that I think we're each excited about for different reasons to get going. And it's on medieval political philosophy, but specifically medieval Islamic slash Arabic political philosophy. The figure looming in the background in all of this, of course, we'll discuss him a little bit, is al-Farabi, but we'll do a deeper dive into Farabi's work in a later episode, perhaps when we have Charles Butterworth on. Today, we're going to devote most of our attention to Averroes and his great text, the Decisive Treatise, with forays into other kind of minor Islamic slash Arabic political philosophers. So with that, Alex, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, well, I thought the Decisive Treatise would be a good selection because it does state clearer than any other text the dilemma that these philosophers faced. Averroes really tries hard to justify on the basis of Islamic text that philosophy is permitted and for a certain group of people obligatory. And in addition, that they should be given fairly free rein to pursue this as they wish and to do so in secret. Now, that's where we're working, but I think also we want to go back kind of to the beginning and just sort of talk about why, in general, Islamic philosophy or political philosophy and you know, what it has to do with us today. It seems very like an abstruse kind of archaic subject, but I do think it has some relevance, right?
I find it fascinating. I mean, I think that it's really a shame that more attention isn't paid to medieval philosophy, medieval political philosophy. I mean, you know, on a personal level, not just on an academic level, sort of as I try to understand myself, as I try to understand the world, you know, the most important question I think for human beings, especially if you're interested in political philosophy, if you're interested in philosophy, is the alternative, the most fundamental alternatives to philosophy. And that most fundamental alternative, I think, is religion or revelation or faith or, you know, prophecy, whatever you want to call it. And so there are these rival, or maybe they're complementary, or who knows, but there are these at least two potential sources of guides for how we ought to live our lives. And I think that's the most important question for human beings. Should I live my life by the light provided by scriptures, by divine revelation, or should I live my life according to the dictates of reason? Now, there are various ways people have tried to harmonize those. We'll see if Averroes is one of those people. But I guess as I go back, I mean, for me, it's a sort of, this is the most important question. And for me, the medieval thinkers, I think the modern thinkers, we've already done a little Machiavelli, and we'll talk more about moderns later. I think that they try to make people forget about this fundamental question. They try to placate us. Montesquieu says, if I can make people rich enough, I can get them to forget about this really important question of revelation. But the medievals, I think, more clearly than anybody else, tried to make clear for us this fundamental alternative. So the ancients, I think, so Plato, we're all big fans of Plato and Xenophon and Aristotle here. They didn't have the serious
Speak for yourself,
challenge.
buddy.
I'll speak for myself. I'm a big fan of those guys, but I think that the polytheistic pagan religion of the Greeks didn't pose as serious of a challenge to the life of the mind, to philosophy, as that is we see in the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic context. And all three are important. I hope we'll do episodes on all three faith traditions, but just so happens that I'll speak for myself. I'll see if Alex agrees. I think political philosophy of the three monotheistic religions, political philosophy emerges first in the Islamic world. I mean, there's Augustine sort of predates, but I'm sort of thinking of the Socratic tradition of political thought. It seems to begin in Islamic political thought, move to Jewish political thought, and then also get involved with Christian political thought. I don't know if you want to jump in and agree or disagree, Alex, with that assessment.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
Sorry, just really quick, Greg. You remind me of first peering into Aquinas's great work, and to find men like Maimonides on the Jewish side cited, but also folks like Al-Farabi and Averroes. It's amazing.
Yeah. The way in which the Greeks are incorporated into all the traditions is really fascinating. I mean, I think the Augustine example is interesting because Christianity was founded right in the midst of Greekdom, which is not really the case of the other two, right? I think one important distinction to draw between Christianity and Islam and Judaism on the other side is the relative absence of law, right? There's this sense, if you're a Jew or a Muslim, that you wake up in the morning, and you have your whole day planned out for you, what's demanded for you. There's very strict, notions about how you ought to live your life, and obviously there are demands that Christianity makes on individuals, but the role of obligatory ritual and all those things that come in, and the obedience, as opposed to, you could say, forgiveness, which is so central in Christianity, makes the problem in a way clearer, precisely because there is no accommodation, or very little accommodation. So one of the things you see in Ghazali, one of the things he's worried about is this very strict form of Islam, where there's a tendency to great literalness about the word of God and what is said, right? And that he's trying to push against. That's very different from Christianity, where you see Jesus speaking in parables and things like that, right? But law is the crucial thing that I think separates it. Even if you have an Augustine, the fact that there was this confrontation between divinely revealed law and the life of reason is something that first emerges so distinctly in the Islamic tradition. Greg, you want to jump in here?
Yes. We probably should get to Ghazali and then Averroes, but maybe at some point we could do an episode where this is probably at least worth mentioning. And this is a bit of a generalization, but I think because of that law aspect, you see in Judaism and Jewish political thought and Islamic political thought a turn to Plato's political thought above all. Whereas in the Christian world, for political thought, they looked principally to Aristotle. And I think that the reason is because of the treatment. They looked to Plato's laws. So it's because of the relative treatment or the relative importance of law in the political theory of each. So great point, Alex. Yeah.
Yeah. And Plato's Laws is in a way the most distinctively Platonic work. I think Strauss makes this point. It's the only dialogue from which Socrates is absent. That implies that this is not a conversation Socrates would have had.
I believe you're forgetting the epinomis.
That's true. Yeah. Greg, who's the famous translator of the epinomis.
Still unpublished.
Yeah. Well, it's the epinomis. Come on. It's the least Socratic dialogue, which suggests that though Plato wrote it, though Socrates would have had that conversation, that there's something distinctively Platonic here. So it's not just that they focused on the laws because it's of interest to them. There seems to be a common thread to both. But to pivot to Ghazali, I think the reason we want to look at Ghazali before looking at Averroes is that two of Averroes' big works, or independent treatises as opposed to his commentaries, make reference to Ghazali. So Ghazali wrote two works of interest here for our purposes. One is The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Hit us with some dates, Alex. Hit us.
What's that?
Can you hit us?
I don't know the dates of these works.
No, not. Sorry.
Of Ghazali?
Yeah.
Ghazali is around 1058 to 1111.
Okay.
But Averroes writes much later. He was born after Ghazali died. He was born in 1126 and died in 1198. Ghazali writes this work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is a very large sort of systematic treatment of various claims made by these Islamic adherents of Aristotle in particular, combating their views and trying to refute them, showing them to be incoherent. Averroes then wrote a response called The Incoherence of the Incoherence, which is, I think, an interesting title. I don't know, Greg, do you have any sense of why he doesn't call it The Coherence of the Philosophers? It's interesting that he's trying to show the other work coherent. Presumably he's also trying to justify his own work, right? Or his own views on things. No.
I think he does that in other works. I mean, I think that the point of, I mean, it's funny and comical. I think that's probably part of it, but it's meant to show that al-Ghazali's incoherence of the philosophers is mistaken. And I mean, the interesting thing about the incoherence of the philosophers, and he goes through, oh gosh, the number escapes me. Maybe you know it, Alex, but he goes through dozens, if not hundreds, of errors that the philosophers have made. But it boils down to three really problematic errors at the end of the book that he repeats in another work of his called The Rescuer from Error. And it's their denial of the resurrection of the bodies, the eternity of the world, and God's knowledge of the particulars in particular that makes them problematic. So he goes through hundreds of their opinions and shows how they're faulty, but those opinions are just kind of bad. But the three biggies for which they can't be excused are the ones, I think I have those right, the ones that I just mentioned. And therefore they're deserving of damnation and burning eternally. Much like you, Bar.
Well, Barr spent a little too much time in the sun today, so he might be already burning. His eternity might have already started.
Can I just point out, by the way, I don't know how much more you want to talk about Ghazali, but I'll just mention that one of the curiosities for me as someone who studies these things somewhat, I mean, I'm not quite an expert on these things, but we talked in our first episode about the appearance and disappearance or recovery of political philosophy and disappearance of political philosophy. That's right. I don't know if you're going to get to this, but Ali G, as I like to call him, I think is probably single-handedly responsible for the destruction of philosophy in the medieval Islamic / Arabic world.
Who's Ali G?
Al-Ghazali.
Just kidding. Yes, right. No, sorry. Go on, Alex.
Yeah. So that's one work of Averroes that's explicitly making reference. Another one is a book called, the one we're talking about, the Decisive Treatise, which refers to Ghazali's work, the Decisive Criterion, which is interesting as a counterpoint to the incoherence. And Averroes at one point does try to bring out the tension between these two works, because while the incoherence of the philosophers is meant to show their unbelief and therefore their deserving of the deservedness of condemnation and punishment and all that, the decisive criterion, that is the decisive criterion for distinguishing genuine belief from godlessness, is the whole title of the work. That's actually considered a work of religious tolerance. He's trying to ease people up from this sort of sectarian infighting where these different factions are just accusing each other of heresy and, arguing that each other needs to put to death. He's trying to slow them down. So you can see two different objectives going on in this.
Yeah, Alex, really quick, can you elucidate a little bit more forcefully what the stakes are here in the Arabic Islamic world? Because from one perspective, I think listeners could be forgiven for mistaking this back and forth across the decades and 100 years that divide these two men as nothing more than kind of scholastic infighting, but between like thinkers of note of their time. But the stakes are really higher than that philosophically. Can you talk just to really quick, give some grounding to that?
Well, I mean, Ghazali, he's not against reading Aristotle simply, right? He does make use of the logical treatises. Averroes points this out, and Ghazali, talks about using demonstrative proof, right? But there's a difference between that and reading the metaphysical works or the physical works of Aristotle and thinking that one can learn from those. So a lot is at stake. The question is whether one can even read Aristotle, what Aristotle one can read, whether one needs to read anything outside of, the sacred text at all, right? So lots at stake. The question is can one pursue one's reading and one's study in peace and in freedom at all? And which is, I think, what makes the Decisive Treatise such an amazing work, because he is trying his best to find a place of freedom despite, this great swell of opposition coming from Ghazali. And one of the ways he does that is by actually appropriating Ghazali's logic against him. So when he's arguing for religious tolerance, Ghazali makes the point that so long as a reasoner believes in the fact that Allah is the sole God and Muhammad is his prophet, if he believes that, then he's free of disbelief. He has to assent to all the opinions, but he's allowed to assent to them on different modes. So I'm just going to review these modes really quickly and particularly focus on the last one, because that's the one that Averroes uses. things can either exist essentially, right, in the way that a physical object actually exists. It can exist sensibly, the way that my perception of that object exists. It can be imaginary or representational, which can either be the mediation between a thing and my perception, or I've made it up. It can be a mental existence in the sense that 1 + 1 is 2, a kind of intellectual existence. But the fifth and most important is analogous or metaphoric existence. I'm just going to give you what al-Ghazali says so you know what Averroes is drawing on. He says, analogical existence is had when the thing itself does not exist in its form or in its essential meaning, or outside, or in sensing, or in the imagination, or in the mind, so none of the other ones, but only something that resembles it, or one of its properties, or one of its qualities exists. Now, think about what that means when you apply that to a sacred text. It means that what the text says exists does not exist. And Ghazali gives some examples of some things that's obviously, cannot have that sort of existence. He quotes a bit of text, talking about the anger of God, talking about God having a right hand and stuff like that. He says this can't be meant literally because this would go against the very nature of God. Well, once you conceded that way of interpreting, right, that this is a principle that's usable, you then have to determine when can it be used. And if you give it pretty free rein, and Averroes seems to want to give it a fair amount of rein, then it might be that one can interpret various things that people are willing to take literally, various parts of the sacred text, and run with it. So I think that's a sort of important background, that while Ghazali is somebody who condemns the philosophers very strongly, and he talks about crypto-Muslims in this work as well, he's also somebody urging for religious tolerance. And that is an angle into creating tolerance for the philosopher that Averroes, as I think Greg can outline right now, is going to exploit.
Yeah. So I guess just something I wanted to address before we move on to Averroes. And this is sort of, I think, really, I mentioned, I think that al-Ghazali is really instrumental in sort of bringing about this ultimate destruction of philosophy, but that sort of seems to be at odds with your account just given of how he's tolerant. But I guess one thing I would say, just to sort of walk back what I was saying a moment ago, is that in this work I just mentioned, The Deliverer from Error or The Rescuer from Error, al-Ghazali goes through the various philosophical sciences and asks the question, are they okay or not okay? And it turns out actually almost all of philosophy is fine. Math is fine. Logic is fine. Natural science is fine. Politics is even fine. Political science, political philosophy, ethics is even fine. Metaphysics, that's where you start to run into issues, and it's because it starts to question some of the accounts of existence that are given in the Quran. And so it's only the metaphysical claims, the inquiries into being, the inquiries into the nature of the world that seem to be problematic for him. So, there is this ambiguity in him. I think that's important. But I guess we should probably move on at this point to a little bit of an overview of the Decisive Treatise. So I'll just kind of give an overview of what the book is, and then I'll turn it over to Alex for some more meat and potatoes kinds of things. But the book is called The Decisive Treatise, right?
This is by Averroes.
By Averroes, by Ibn Rushd, yes. It's called, there's actually a longer title in the manuscripts that it tends, we tend not to call it this. You'll see why in just a moment. So here's the full title of the book. So it's The Decisive Treatise. What's it decisively treating so well? Here's the full title. Book of decisively judging the statement and determining the connection between the law, Sharia, and wisdom. So this emphasis on law that Alex was talking about a moment ago. So this book, purportedly by Averroes, is going to settle for us once and for all, decisively, the question of the relationship between the law, Sharia, and wisdom. So let me put a little bit of meat to that. Is philosophy okay or not, according to Islamic law? And Averroes is going to answer that question for us authoritatively and decisively. So I'll just lay out the book in the parts as I see it. There's a brief introduction. The introduction makes clear that Averroes is engaged in a certain kind of writing. It sounds highly legalistic. I think that's important, right? Because it's decisively telling us the status of philosophy under the law. And so he's speaking like a lawyer might speak, recognizing the authority of the court.
Rhetorically, I think is important because he outlines different modes of speech, right? So it's a justification, rhetorical, almost like law court speech in defense of philosophy, not a philosophic defense of philosophy, right? Would you say that or
Yeah.
no?
Well, it depends. No, would be my first answer. No.
Okay.
I mean, except that I think that I think the rhetoric masks of philosophy. So very, very simply, so the first major part of the book is Averroes trying to ask this question: is philosophy okay or not okay? Turns out it's okay. And that's actually me being a little bit loose with the language. Not only is it okay, it's obligatory for some people, right? But he gives a logical argument to prove, ostensibly, that philosophy is not just okay, but it's actually obligatory for some people. That, in other words, that the law commands some Muslims to engage in philosophy. Let me make this a little more preposterous. He then goes on basically to tease out, you know what? Not only is philosophy imperative, you actually have to read Aristotle. The Sharia commands you to read Aristotle and Plato, right? I mean, this is sort of, we would think that's preposterous. Now that argument,
because it's so difficult, right? You have to go to whoever's done it already. So just read all the books, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
but interestingly, sorry, I don't mean to
go
interrupt.
ahead. No, jump in.
Interestingly enough, that kind of urging commandment encourages people to seek out and commingle with philosophers. They're the worst people to commingle with.
And
from a piety point of view.
I try to avoid them at all costs.
Yeah. There are no real philosophers on this show, so it's fine.
You're safe with us. We promise. Okay, so the first part of the book is this argument proving that philosophy and logic are obligatory. Maybe Alex will get into this, I'm not sure, but the argument is not sound. It's actually a very bad argument. The next major part is showing us that whatever we can know by science, whatever we can know by demonstration, logic, must accord with the Quran. It must accord with the law. There can't be a contradiction between what reason, science, knowledge tells us about the world and what the Quran tells us. I'll just give a little
because
bit of
both are true. That's
because both are true.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, because both are true. So I'll just say, just biographically, for me, I first read this text as an undergraduate at Emory University with a lady named Anne Hartle. She was a professor of medieval philosophy. She's an Augustine scholar, a really wonderful lady. She was the first one who introduced me to this work. And I'll just say, I'll explain it in just a second, but for me, this was really important at that time, I was a young man trying to think through these questions of faith. So I'll give just a very simple example. So what science tells us is true and what the Quran tells us is true, and they can't contradict one another. And so what do? You're a serious thinking person. You're reading your Quran, you're reading your Bible, you're reading the Pentateuch, and you encounter something that you sort of think, that doesn't sound right. The moon stopped and moved backwards. The ocean parted. Whatever, anything that would seem to suspend what we might say would be natural necessity. How does an intelligent reader deal with that? And Averroes, not al-Ghazali. For me, Averroes provides the reader with a really interesting way to consider this problem. What do you do when reason and revelation seem to be in some tension? And he says, look, they can't be in tension. And anytime there seems to be a contradiction between the Quran or the law and reason or science, philosophy, it's only an apparent tension or contradiction. And so what you do then is you must read such passages allegorically. If you're a sufficiently trained person who can understand science, you interpret these passages, which is to say you take them as being somewhat allegorical. Now, not everyone can read the books this way, and that's okay. So if your grandma, Alex, says, God, I saw God last night and he's sitting in heaven on a throne and he has a crown, you should say, according to Averroes, to grandmother, that's fine. You're a believer and you have a place in paradise. And so for me, this is a really interesting way
my grandmother's dead, so.
Well, now she's in heaven, Alex. Hopefully she's
you didn't know my grandmother.
Soul.
Just kidding. I love your grandma.
Wait, she's alive?
Rest in peace.
Oh.
One of them is.
I was thinking about the alive one, for God's sake. In any event, so I'll just mention this one more time just to wrap it up, and then I'll try and bring us to what else the book is doing. So for me, the two most important parts of the book for me are these two parts, right? Proving that philosophy is okay and then telling you how to read scriptures. I thought it was a really wonderful map for thinking those things through. Now, there are all kind of problems that get insinuated into this, and maybe we'll tease it out. Let me just finish what the book's about and then turn it over to Alex. Maybe he'll tell us how this is how it relates to al-Ghazali. The other thing the book does, the Decisive Treatise, is after telling you that philosophy is okay and telling you how to read scriptures, it then says, what's the point of the law? Why did the prophet lay out these laws for us? And the answer is because he wanted us to live well together. God wants us to live well together. And so then the next thing is, well, all of these various people are interpreting the law in various ways. I just mentioned Alex's grandmother, who has a very simplistic understanding of scriptures. And then there's Alex, who doesn't read scriptures at all, but if he did, in any event. So the point is,
or you could be Bar and just read Desaad all the time. We all have our own axe to grind.
Desaad's not scripture.
So just to bring it back, so the question then is, okay, so we have all these different people interpreting the laws in various ways, but the purpose of the law is to help us live together in harmony. And so as you can see, there's this tolerance built in. If you interpret it one way, you ought to be tolerant of someone who interprets it in a different way. And so the book ends with a sort of rather long account of what to do with people who have various schools of interpretation, various factions. And Averroes says, if you really understand things, you will understand that there is a variety of human types, that people, for whatever reason, their capacity or they're simply too busy, people have different capacities to understand scriptures. And so the more intelligent readings ought to be more tolerant of the less intelligent readings, because we all ought to get along together. That's a kind of overview of what the book is doing. I'd stress again that there's at least this rhetorical appearance of being highly legalistic, but I think that's enough to get you started out.
Yeah, and so there's two things you said at the end that I really want to focus in on that are really related to Ghazali. So in section 27, I should point out, I'm the only one on this podcast who has not studied with Charles Butterworth, yet I'm the only one who feels, that I ought to, plug. Charles Butterworth has done a wonderful translation for Brigham Young University Press. But we're using his translation.
Why would you do that? Why would you try and make us look bad in the eyes of our mentor? That's not fair. Yes, Charles E. Butterworth, we're using his translation. Brigham Young University Press, they actually do an excellent translation series for it's worth facing.
And Greg Butterworth is translated five or six of Averroes.
Well, we're hoping to interview him so we can
that's right.
his
Sorry,
brain
we'll save
about this
that.
stuff.
We'll save
What
that.
does
Alex
the E
has praised him,
stand
and now he
for?
just wants to move on.
What's the E stand for?
Excellence.
Okay.
I don't know.
Exoteric.
You included it. I felt like it mattered to you.
That's what he got. It's his professional. I don't know.
Oh no, you know what it is because there's a Charles Butterworth who's a Tinseltown actor.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Okay. Anyways, back to Averroes. So in section 27, and so I want to touch on what Greg had to say about allegorical interpretation. Section 27, he discusses briefly, tying it to Ghazali. He says, this is the reason for the law being divided into an apparent sense and an inner sense. For the apparent sense is those likenesses coined for those meanings, the meanings being the inner sense, and the inner sense is those meanings that reveal themselves only to those adept in demonstration. These likenesses and meanings are the 4 or 5 sorts of existing things that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali mentioned in the book, The Distinction, or what I've been calling the Decisive Criterion. So you see that he's actually appropriating Ghazali's logic and expanding it even further. Another point I'll add that Greg brought up is his distinctions in types of people. There are 3 modes of speech necessary for the 3 different kinds. One is persuasion or rhetoric. That's used for people generally who cannot understand demonstrations. Then there's dialectic, right, which argues on the basis of some commonly held or individually held opinion and produces belief or conviction out of that. And the third and highest and most difficult kind is demonstration. The Greek word is apodoxis. It means literally showing down from some first principles. It's the firmest kind of proof you can have. Now, this distinction, correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, he doesn't get this distinction from the Quran, does he? He seems to see it latent in the Quran, but it's not like the Quran tells you there are three kinds of men. There's one textual basis a little bit, right? But it seems primarily to be a kind of ancient sort of natural hierarchy teaching.
Let me
right?
actually, since you asked, this is in section 14. So I mentioned I'm not going to go through the whole argument right now, but when he's trying to prove that philosophy is okay, he does some funny things that are probably worth some mention. But one of them is I'm sure one of our listeners will correct me on this, but my understanding is that the Quran originally there's no punctuation. And so one of the things he does, to your point, Alex, about are there different types or is there this hierarchy of human types, is he points to a passage in the Quran, the third surah, verse 7, where I'll just read it for you. Here's the verse as it's set out in the Quran, the way it's punctuated most of the time. He it is who has sent down to you the book. In it there are fixed verses. Now that verse there, and it says, and no one should inquire into it, period, apparently, except for God. Now, Averroes has said, so the next sentence then begins, and those well-grounded in science do blah, 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 blah. So Averroes says, that sentence says, no one should inquire into it except for God and those well-grounded in science, period. So Averroes moves the period because there is no period in the original Arabic. And so therefore Averroes says, here is this Quranic evidence that there's a variation in types. Other people have to take what's set down and don't search for the inner meanings, but those well-grounded in science, it's okay for them to do it. So he does point to this Quranic source for what you were just talking about, Alex.
Yeah, and so there's a Quranic source, and as you point out, right, the punctuation is ambiguous. And I think that's helpful because a lot hangs on that. So if the punctuation goes against Averroes' intention, then it seems like you're not allowed to inquire in the law, and you must be a kind of harsh literalist. Am I right in thinking that, Greg?
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, I mean, in the original Arabic, there wasn't the punctuation. So, yeah. I mean, you can say he's changing things, which maybe that's right, but you can also just say, well, it wasn't there, and so how ought one to interpret it? But you're right. If you put the period but at the before, except for those adept at science, then yes, it would seem to imply a strict literalism.
Yeah, and so but that suffices for Ghazali because Ghazali's kind of already opened the floodgates. I'm going to read a short passage from the end of chapter 5 of the Decisive Criterion, and he's discussing two different interpretations. He says, our aim is not to justify one of the two interpretations, like to settle this question of interpretation. Rather, it is that you may know that every faction, even though it goes far in holding fast to literal meanings, is compelled to use interpretation, meaning you just have to interpret with some verses. Unless one exceeds the bounds in stupidity and ignorance and affirms that the black stone is actually a right hand, and that death, even though it is an accident, is transformed and changed into a ram, etc., etc. Now, anyone who reaches this degree of ignorance has been stripped of the noose of reason, right? So even Ghazali concedes that you can't be a hyper-literalist, right? So it's not that all interpretation is forbidden. So he would actually maybe agree. I don't know if there's any discussion of this. He might actually agree with the punctuation point because it would forbid him as well, right?
Yeah.
So Ghazali, even though he's so anti-philosophic, has a slight wedge that Averroes can work with, as opposed to these harsh literalists, with whom I assume Averroes and Ghazali would be united. Obviously, their dates don't overlap. Would be united in opposing because they both allow for some interpretation.
Yeah. I want to make sure I get that since I just found the passage in the Quran, so I just want to read this for you so you can see the fun part here. So Quran, Surah 3, verse 7. He it is who has set down to thee the book. No one knows its hidden meanings except for God, Allah. Period or not period? Next sentence. And those who are firmly grounded in knowledge, they say, blah, 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 blah. So if it's no one knows their meaning except Allah, period, that's different than no one knows their meaning except Allah and those who are firmly grounded in knowledge or science. So sorry to take us on that digression, but I thought it was important to maybe try and get the quote somewhat precise.
No, I think that's helpful. And so one point that I then want to pivot to is the degree of freedom that Averroes allows philosophers. So if we go to section 23, I think we get a nice statement on this where it's pretty clear that he's drawing So it says, it seems that those who disagree about the interpretation of these recondite questions have either hit the mark or to be rewarded and are to be rewarded, or they have erred and are to be excused. For assent to something due to an indication arising in the soul is compulsory, not voluntary. I mean, that it's not up to us not to assent or to assent, as it is up to us to stand up or not to stand up. Since a condition of responsibility is having choice, the one who assents to error because of vagueness occurring in it is excused if he is an adept of science. So if you are skilled in science, you're allowed to make mistakes. If you're not, if you're one of the, an average Joe Muslim, you're not.
Average right? David Barr.
Yeah, you're average David Barr.
Yeah, that's a good point. That passage you just read always stuck with me. I mean, this is something that we'll probably talk about in other episodes too, but you don't choose what you believe in.
That's right.
Assent is not up to you. I could not choose to believe that 2 + 2 = 3. And that's a sort of fascinating thing. I mean, because we think about how much religion.
It took a lot of courage, Greg. It took a lot of courage for you.
Thank you. You're welcome. But I mean,
you doing all right there, David?
I've been out in the sun today.
David is drunk on the sunshine. I think he had a few Mai Tais.
No, I was out in the sun. I don't want to get into it. I'm fried, man. Anyway.
It's all right. Another point I want to, that I really like is section 31. We can jump to that. That one is another interesting use of this logic. Here he says, there is a third sort of verses and traditions. This is a very odd sentence, so I'll have to sort of translate it into plainer speech. There's a third sort of verses with respect to the law, one wavering between the other two sorts, and about which there is doubt. One group of those who occupy themselves with reflection attach this sort to the apparent sense that it is not permissible to interpret. So some of the learned think you're not allowed to interpret this. You have to take it at face value. Others, however, attach it to the inner sense that it is not permissible for the learned to take according to its apparent sense. So some of the learned says you're forbidden from deviating from the apparent sense. Others say you are forbidden from sticking to the apparent sense. What do you do here? When one of the learned, al-Ghazali, for example, says, you're not allowed to interpret this. You've gone too far. And then another, let's say an Averroes, says, no, you have to interpret it. You're not allowed to stick to the apparent sense. Well, he says, one who commits an error with respect to this is to be excused. I mean, one of the learned, right? So the average person can't make these mistakes. And even if you see Averroes and you say, hey, Averroes, what are you doing? This is horrible. This is unbelief. Averroes says, you can't tell on me. You can't tell the people. And that's, I think, an amazing thing he's done. He's really carved himself a sort of freedom that even with those who might see what he has to say or might hear what he actually thinks and how he interprets the Quran, he's allowed to do what he wants, right? So long as he believes that that's permitted.
So a few minutes ago, Greg rushed to his Quran and gave a kind of a nice interpretation on one of the passages. But if the readers of the Decisive Treatise, his target audience then are these religious jurists, right? And his success rises or falls on his ability to convince them. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's fair, yeah.
But why would they interpret the passage you just read, or the passage Greg interpreted for us, in a way that's favorable to Averroes and not just revert back to their mentality?
I think his audience, that's a great question. I think in part his audience are these theologians, these jurists, these religious legal scholars. But I suspect that it's also a certain type of intelligent young person who might be confused about the conflicting sources of wisdom. And so I think part of what he's doing is trying to introduce or make philosophy acceptable to a certain human type. And that, like I said, people who, you read your Bible, you read your Quran, you're like, what's going on? This doesn't sound rational. This doesn't sound reasonable. I think he's trying to provide you with an avenue to sort of try to figure out how to resolve that tension for yourself. And so I think he does have this political project. I think this is a deeply apologetic work. But I think while it's doing that, it's trying also simultaneously to attract new sheep to the flock, as it were.
That's right. And if I can change your question slightly, David, it's not that they would interpret it that way. I think the main thing he's trying to do is say that even if you disagree, you're not allowed to publish it. And so then the question is, why is it forbidden to talk about demonstrations? Why, for example, was it wrong for Ghazali to publish The Incoherence of the Philosophers? So in sections 34 and 35, let me put it actually in 35, he says the following. He says, "This is why it is obligatory that interpretations be established only in books using demonstrations. For if they are in books using demonstrations, no one but those adept in demonstration will get at them. Whereas if they are established in other than demonstrative books, with poetical and rhetorical and dialectical methods used in them, as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali does, that is an error against the law and against wisdom." Why? Well, go back to 34. I do need this. He says, "Anyone adept in interpretation who divulges that to him calls him to unbelief. And the one who calls to unbelief is an unbeliever." So if you start publishing these interpretations, you start decreasing faith. The reason certain people rely on persuasion, Averroes essentially is arguing, is because anything else will shake their unbelief. That's why he might say God or the prophet gives you laws, right? Because law is what works for the majority of men. Now, for people who are adept in demonstration, they can go on interpreting, and they can go even further and dig deeper, and they'll find out that the law also speaks to them. But that's not something you want to be loud about, he's saying.
The learned have a duty to stay quiet, you're saying.
Exactly. And not just a duty based on the fact that it goes against the law. It decreases belief, right? When you start, and you see this, I think, sometimes when people will raise very facile contradictions, right? Oh, why are there days of creation, but the sun hasn't been made yet, right? Well, one who thinks about these things seriously and is not sort of easily put off can come up with a plausible solution to that question. But if you allow that kind of questioning out in the open, people will facilely reject it.
Can we just say, by the way, on that specific question, I think the Averroist answer to that question, what do you do with "there was no sun, but there were days," is, well, that must be a passage that one has to interpret allegorically. And so that's an Averroist reading of the creation story.
Yeah. So days is meant differently. And that's typically how people resolve this problem. So then so after he says, this is what Ghazali does, and it's an error against the law and against wisdom. Now, according to Averroes, if you make that error, you're to be forgiven, right? As one of the learned. And this is what he does. I think with a remarkable amount of humanity, maybe a little condescension, he goes on to say, "Yet the man, that is Ghazali, intended only good. That is, he wished thereby to make those adept in science more numerous. But he actually made those adept in wickedness more numerous, yet not without some increase among those adept in science. In that way, one group came to slander wisdom, another group to slander the law, and another group to reconcile the two. It seems that this was one of the intentions of his books." And he talks about how he kind of mimicked whoever his audience was. So, I think Averroes does something quite nice here, where he argues for a kind of tolerance, condemns Ghazali with unbelief and with a sin against wisdom and the law, and then forgives him immediately, as though to show that this is how he lives, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, so do we want to move on to
since you're talking about the verses and stuff like this, I think you focused on the central case. So I already mentioned the idea that you ought to interpret, the allegorical passages of Scripture, but you already drew our attention to one of the kinds. So maybe it's worth pointing out, and I'll just reemphasize what you said, that as one reads the Quran, as one reads Scriptures, there are three kinds of verses: ones that should be interpreted, ones that should not be interpreted, and there are ones that everyone should interpret, there are ones that some should interpret, and there are ones that no one should interpret. There are some that you just simply have to take at face value, and those are the roots, he says, the roots of the law. That if you were to get rid of those, the whole structure would come tumbling down. And so your interpretation doesn't guide every kind of Quranic verse, for what it's worth.
Yeah,
Although
so
we'll see that that's a big problem, I think.
that's in section 28, right? Do you want to go through that one? Because I love this
Sure.
one. I like comparing this with a later passage as well. Why don't you
Yeah.
go through 28 and then I'll bring in another?
Okay, so all right, fine. So then this is all right. So then I'll take another step back. So I said there's the three types of verses. This is so section 28 is in the middle of. So Averroes goes through. So first, he's established that interpretation is what you do when your reason seems to be in conflict with revelation. But then he says, look, there's some limitations on your interpretation. Okay, so you can't just interpret willy nilly. So your interpretation shouldn't violate the Arabic language, he says. That's the first limitation. Secondly, if you have to interpret, you should find a passage where the meaning in somewhere else accords with the interpretation that you've laid forward. Okay. Third, you're not allowed to interpret any passage where there's a consensus among all Muslims. So if everybody agrees, you're not allowed to interpret. Fourth, I think this
I mean,
is
that's kind of
section 20.
funny, right? Because if you disagree, then everyone doesn't agree, right?
I think actually all of them fall away by the wayside for what it's worth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it doesn't violate the Arabic language, then you can. Well, I mean, wouldn't any interpretation somehow be in accord with the Arabic language? So yeah, I think all of these limitations that Averroes puts on interpretation, I think you'll see that they're all problematic. The fifth one is the big problem, the one I just said, the roots. You can't violate the roots of the law. But you asked about 28, and that's the fourth restriction on interpretation. It's
is that right? Okay.
Yes, it is. So section 28 is the fourth kind. Teachings known through all three kinds of argument must not be interpreted. You're not allowed to interpret anything where science, dialectics, and rhetoric all agree. But this isn't even a restriction either, because why would you need to interpret something where there's no tension between science, dialectics, and rhetoric? But we can read that passage if you want. I know you wanted to go through it, so we'll give it a shot.
Why don't you read it? Because I think he does refer to the roots here, right?
He does refer to the roots. That's right.
Yeah.
So here's Averroes, section 20. If it happens, as we have said, that we know something in itself by means of the three methods, the ones I just mentioned, there is no need for us to coin a likeness for it. And as long as it, in its apparent sense, it does not admit of interpretation. If this manner of apparent sense refers to the roots of the law, the one who interprets it would be an unbeliever, like someone believing that there is no happiness or misery in the hereafter, and that such a statement is intended only to safeguard people from one another in what pertains to their bodies and physical senses, that it is a stratagem, and that a human being has no end other than sensual existence.
Religion is the opiate of the masses, man. Right? That's the view there.
Yeah, that's right.
I find this really a kind of this is a very, I think, coy statement, right? Because he's offering the interpretation he says you're not allowed to make, right? And he's putting it before his audience to think about it. I want to think about
Hold
that.
Hold on. So you're telling me, Alex, that some people interpret eternal damnation as allegorical, and it's a statement in the law that's only intended as a safeguard for people from one another in what pertains to their body and physical senses?
Hey, I'm telling you what some people say. I'm not saying it. Right?
Some people say that. Okay. Good.
Some people, you know.
All right. People say.
Yeah.
Listen, this is a good time to pause the episode and remind listeners to send all mail. Anyway.
Yeah.
Not to David.
Yeah. Let's not condemn David. So I want to look at 48 because I think that when I read 28 and 48 together, I get a lot of questions. Okay. So 48, he says this. Here is a likeness of these people's intention as contrasted with the intention of the lawgiver. Someone is intent upon going to a skilled physician, who is in turn intent upon preserving the health of all the people and removing sickness from them by setting down for them statements to which there is common assent about the obligation of practicing the things that preserve their health and remove their sickness, as well as avoiding the contrary things. So it sounds like it's borrowed from Plato's Statesman, but something like this happens in the Statesman where Plato says, Socrates, or the stranger rather, says, if a doctor is going to go away, right, or you have to give general rules to people, you're going to have to just give some statements, right? You can't go person by person. So this is an equivalent to a lawgiver. So the lawgiver here is the doctor. And he gives some statements, guidance to give their life, because not everybody can understand and become a physician. Averroes continues. He goes, he is not able to make them all become physicians because the physician is the one who knows by demonstrative methods the things that preserve health and remove sickness. Then this one goes out to the people, that is the false version, says to them, these methods this physician has set down for you are not true. And he sets about rejecting them until they have rejected them. Or he says, they have interpretations, right? Hidden teachings. Yet they do not understand them and thus come to no assent as to what to do before them. He's talking about somebody destructive of the law. Now, what results on this? This is what Averroes wants to ask. Now, are you of the opinion that people who are in this condition will do any of the things useful for preserving health and removing sickness? Or will this one, who has declared that they should reject what they used to believe about those things, be able to practice that with them? I mean, preserving health. No, rather he will not be able to practice these with them, nor will they be able to practice them, and perdition will encompass them all. So my question here is, let's translate this out of the allegory, or out of this likeness, right? This allegory. What is perdition here? Well, in the context of the analogy, perdition is dying of a kind of sickness, a sickness that comes from not following the law, and a literal death. Well, what's the perdition that comes from disobeying the law?
Are you
Is it
asking
clear?
us?
Yeah, I'm asking the listener.
I think David fell
the folks
asleep.
at home. Yeah.
Oh,
David
I see.
has died. Yeah. I think it's an important question we want to ask, right? Is the perdition eternal damnation? Are we meant to translate it that way? Or is the perdition, as the opiate of the masses guy says, the dissolution of the political community, right? He offers a likeness that I think goes both ways. It puzzles me here because I don't know which way to go with it. So who knows? What is the root of the law is one way to ask this, ultimately. Yeah.
Can I think that this rhetorical device here, this to me, this suggests, I sort of read section 48 as Averroes maybe partly telling us about his own project here. That he's acting as a kind of physician lawgiver, trying to preserve the health of all people. So he's trying to bring us back to this harmony, trying to get rid of faction, these things.
Yeah, that's good.
I think, therefore, the scientist, the philosopher, can perform a politically salutary role in his view here. Right? There's something. I mean, Al-Farabi does this perhaps even better than Averroes, but and Maimonides does this for the Jewish tradition. Right? There's a sort of moderating. We all know that in any given religion, there are zealots who can sort of take things to immoderate extremes, and so I think that sometimes these thinkers can come along. And ultimately, I think they have their roots in Aristotle, who's trying to moderate some of the Greek conceptions of the gods, but more so of morality. We talked about his account of courage earlier. And so there's this way that there's this moderating influence that these thinkers attempt to have on the political community around them to try to preserve their health. Yeah. I think that's what he's doing here.
So if Ghazali is the bad physician who says, hey, look, they're up to no good, right? Or it's false or whatever, then Averroes is the good physician. And what he would be solving is the faction, right? The dissolution of the community. So perdition here,
the healing,
right? The kind of faith he's trying to instill and thereby heal the community is a matter of unity in this world, political unity. And that's it. But then again, the physician is a lawgiver. So then we want to say, is that true even of the divinely revealed law? This is what I find so amazing about this work, and why I mean, maybe I disagree with you about this, Greg, but I do think it is a rhetorical work at bottom, precisely because these fundamental questions don't actually get answered, do they? About what is the root of the law really? What does Averroes actually believe? How far is he actually willing to go with allegorical interpretation? What do we do with those problems that you raise about interpretation, right?
So, I mean, I guess maybe our disagreement is maybe it's more semantic than real, but yes, of course it's a rhetorical work. But I guess the reason I wanted to say that it's more than that, maybe it's philosophic, is because I think those problems that I pointed out, I think it's rhetorical, and I think he's trying to achieve rhetorical goals, right? What is he trying to achieve? He's trying to justify philosophy before the bar of the city, just like Plato and Aristotle before him. He's trying to make sure that we all understand that philosophy is okay. I think he's trying to heal the community. He's trying to get the community to get along and go along. But I think he's also simultaneously I think that the work is philosophic insofar as those adept at science. So you're reading this and you're like, well, if you're adept at science, you can interpret. And so I think if you fancy yourself an intelligent person, you might say, I'd like to do this. And so I think he's planting seeds, breadcrumbs along the way, signposts along the way, to point the philosophically adept to the deeper teaching. So very simply, I mean, he gives a logical argument at the beginning, and maybe we can return to that, showing or proving that philosophy is okay. And so I think there's a certain type of reader who will just read this bad argument and go, fantastic, I can do some science, happy to do it. But I think the more philosophically inclined might start realizing that, by the way, he's using a bad logical argument to prove that it's okay to study logic.
That's right. Yeah.
and so I think that's why I'm saying it's not simply rhetorical. It might lead a sort of logically minded person to say, okay, let's get down to brass tacks and examine this argument that philosophy is okay. Because I mean, it has premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And I think the premises are questionable, and the conclusion does not follow from the premises.
That's right.
Do you want to go through that or no?
Yeah, we can go through. I mean, one thing I would say just on the point about
Sure.
it being philosophical is there's all this talk about demonstration, right? Using demonstration.
Science. Yeah.
And yet there's also all this talk about error and being wrong even about the most fundamental things, and it's supposed to be excused. And you could say that the tension between those is in a way Socratic, right? This attempt to give a demonstration and then find. So maybe it's not a work of demonstration or scientific, we could say, and for that reason philosophical. That there's a sort of open-endedness about it. Maybe it's dialectical, you want to say, and there's something more in common with dialectic. But I do think that that's absolutely the case. Do you want to let's give that proof, just because it is the core of the work, and we're getting towards the end, and we should probably at least mention it, right?
Can I
talk about it?
Can I give a rough, dirty one, and then
Sure.
and then maybe we can flesh it out a little more simply? Okay, so here's the simple, quick version. Premise 1: if philosophy is just thinking about stuff. Premise 1. Premise 2: if the Quran tells us to think about stuff. Conclusion: philosophy is commanded.
Yeah.
That's the syllogism. I mean, it's a little more complex than that, but that's it stripped down to its bare parts. So the first one, literally, I almost said that literally. The first premise is, if philosophy is nothing other than reflection on the beings, that's premise 1. Okay. And premise 2, let's see if I can find my spot here. If the law permits reflection on the beings, then philosophy is obligatory. Hopefully you notice that there was a move from permitted to obligatory. So permitted in the premise, obligatory in the conclusion. And I'll just mention that under Sharia, Averroes is playing with 5 traditional Islamic categories of whether things are acceptable or not. So there's things that are obligatory for Muslims, things that are recommended for Muslims, things that are prohibited, things that are reprehensible, and things that are permitted. So premise number 1, philosophy is only a reflection on the beings. I know that Alex is a big metaphysician. I'm not. I sort of think maybe we can do philosophy about ethics or something like this. It's not just reflection on the beings, but that's fine. We can debate that. The second one, does the law command us to reflect on the beings? He gives, I think, 5 Quranic passages to prove that the Quran commands us to reflect on the beings. I'll just give my favorite one. There's a passage in the Quran that says, look at the camels.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really funny. I was thinking about that actually earlier today. That
you saw some camels?
No. I was thinking about, in Plato, it comes up every now and then, the problem of the mule.
I see.
So the mule combines the virtues of the horse and the virtues of the donkey with none of the vices, and yet it can't reproduce. So the best animal is defective in probably the most important way of being able to reproduce itself. I wonder if maybe the Quran, if it had caused us to reflect on the mule, maybe then it would have condoned philosophy. But I think Once again,
by the way, Xenophon talks about camels. So again, Xenophon's superiority to Plato. But anyway, go ahead.
When I took introductory Greek, one of the first words we learned was camelos, which is that right? I guess is Greek for camel. And I was just like, why am I learning this word of all words? It turns out I think it's Herodotus. We were reading Herodotus later.
Gotcha.
No, but the big question I have with this is philosophy reflection on the beings?
Is
Or-
that all? Nothing more than that. That's
Nothing
all
more
it
than that.
is.
Or is it reflection on being or the whole, right?
Yeah.
The whole of things.
Yeah, good
and-
point. So that's a very good point. Beings plural in his premise, not being singular. Very good.
Yeah, and I think that in a way is an interesting point to me, because that suggests that he doesn't need to answer that question in this context.
Yeah.
Because all he needs to do is secure a kind of secret freedom, which I think, is where his argument eventually ends up.
Yeah.
And then he can think about beings, the whole, and if anybody comes up to him and is like, hey, what are you doing, Averroes? He can say, I'm thinking about camels. Don't worry about it. Right.
Can I just restate since I found my notes here, I just want to restate the syllogism to make sure that, I'm sure there's some readers out there, we're going to get hate mail saying McBrayer didn't get it precise, so I'll just get it precise. Premise 1, if philosophy is nothing more than reflection and consideration of existing things. Premise 2, if the law recommends or urges consideration of existing things, then conclusion, philosophy is either obligatory or recommended. He switched, and urged went away, and it's now obligatory or recommended. But that's a small point, sorry.
Should we have a correction section of the podcast whenever we get? Probably it'll be too long.
Errata.
It'll just involve deep shaming. We have to wrap up. We're nearing time. One reflection I had, obviously I've been quiet. I had terrible sunstroke today. That's not a metaphor for it's like a bout of wisdom or something. I was just
what were you doing out in the sun all day?
So I took the kids to the beach. It was terrible.
Oh man,
he's contemplating the forms. He left the cave for the day.
Yeah. Somebody's gonna rent my body limb to limb. But I admire this manner that Averroes treats very delicate conversations with revealed religion is so interesting in contrast to what would occur just a few hundred years later during the Enlightenment, when the relationship was exploded by various types of thinkers like Voltaire, where there's no subtlety for the encyclopedists. I mean, this is such a subtle treatise. I mean, the way that he's talking about how to dance around, I mean, it's this subtle dance that not everybody's going to understand. It has many, many layers. It's a kind of model. And I wonder, this question may be too radioactive, so you guys don't need to answer it. But I wonder if it comes to defanging the excesses of revealed religion, is Averroes' model preferable to that of, say, some of the Enlightenment thinkers? Or is this kind of a wrong-headed question?
Can I take a stab at that, Alex? Is that okay?
Did that make sense? I don't know.
No, it's a great question.
Go right
I
ahead.
thought it was fantastic. I'm going to give as is my wont, our listeners will know my Weasley answers. So Averroes was enormously influential within Christianity. So you're talking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment takes place in the West, and in the Christian West principally. And so prior to the Enlightenment, there was the emergence of a certain kind of Christian school of thinking, the so-called Latin Averroes. I think that turn of phrase was actually invented much later by a French philosopher named Renan. But in any event, the title is apt. There were people who were influenced by it's a misnomer only as far as it's wrong. It's not Averroes. It's ultimately Al-Farabi. But this kind of rational, subtle, careful treatment of religion was tried in Christianity with some success, with some failures. Ultimately, I think it failed. And so I forget what it's called. Maybe Alex or David will remind me. But there were these prohibitions that went out in the Catholic Church. Things weren't allowed to be taught. The propositions, it's some number, 300 and some odd propositions that weren't allowed to be taught. So all within the Catholic Church, some church thinkers became greatly aware of this Averroes strand and basically effectively stamped it out. And so I think what you see in the Enlightenment, this defanging, this much more direct, hostile attack on revelation, on religion, is because this Averroist attempt didn't work. Now, maybe, and Alex already alluded to one of the possible reasons why, it's possible that the status of the law in Islam and Judaism was more hospitable to this Averroist interpretation than it would have been in the Christian world. And so you do get these later, just these vicious attack, like you mentioned, but also Machiavelli, of course, and Spinoza and others. So I think that's right. Now, so which one's better? I'm sorry, I know we need to wrap up, but it depends on what you mean. Which one's better for the political community? That's one way to ask the question. Another is which one's better for intellectual clarity? And as I mentioned at, I think, the start of the podcast, the moderns, I don't think they actually refute what they think they set out and refuted with Revelation. I think they tried to get us to forget about it. I think it was an enormously successful rhetorical project, but I think it mostly bracketed the fundamental intellectual challenges. So again, why should you read medieval political thinkers? Because I think they address this question more directly than the moderns who just attack it.
That's right. And okay. Sorry, I have more to say, but
No, jump in.
No. This is good. This episode, we are going to have to do extended episodes.
Yeah, we should return to this.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I got to say, we've given a very simplistic kind of overview. Like, there's so many subtle sort of categories, and his discussions are so nuanced, and there's all these sort of weird puzzles and questions that emerge. I mean, going through this section by section, and it's a short book. I think it's like 15, 20 pages, whatever it is. And it just pays reading very, very carefully. We have barely scratched the surface. We've just kind of done a greatest hits, but the devil's always in the details with this as with other texts.
Yes. And on the note of the devil, I would ask everybody to follow us on Twitter at The New Thinkery, email thenewthinkery@gmail.com, visit our website at thenewthinkery.com. Don't forget to review us well and subscribe, pass along words to friends and family. And again, we'd like to thank our producer, Jake Gannon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See you next time.